Every 7 years, every single Jewish person would gather in Yerushalayim on the second day of Sukkot to hear the king read rousing, inspiring passages from the Torah as part of the mitzvah of Hakhel, which is described in this week's parasha. We're going to see that when Rashi describes some of the details of Hakhel, he seems to focus on some and leave out others. We need to understand what is bothering Rashi. What did he have to clarify that we might have misunderstood about the mitzvah of Hakhel? We're also going to see if the details he mentions are specific to the role of the king or specific to the mitzvah of Hakhel, and we're going to learn a lesson in our own lives that Hakhel teaches us and why we all need to have our own king experience reading us those inspiring teachings and passages of Torah. When it gets to mitzvahs Hakhel state in the Mishnah and in Gemara with regards to the mitzvah of Hakhel, both the Mishnah and the Gemara tell us Kama Pratim, various details you can see in Masechta Soita, whereas Rashi Pratim Achodim Binyan Zeh, Rashi in his commentary on the parasha only mentions some of those details. If Rashi selects certain details, it must be because those specific details are the ones that are most relevant to understanding the simplest meaning of the pasuk. Let's see what Rashi focuses on. So first of all, Rashi quotes the words from the pasuk that say, Tikra es ha-Torah hazos, that this is a day when he, the king, will read this Torah. On his Mephorish, he explains, what does it mean? Ha-melech ha-yakoira. Firstly, he says, Tikra, he, the king, would read. What would he read? Ha-Torah hazos, this Torah, which is what? Mitchilas eila ha-dvarim, from the beginning of Sefer Dvarim. Then Rashi references Kiddusim in Masechta Soita as described in Masechta Soita. And then he goes back to the details. Where was the king when he read it? Al bima shel eitza yoisim ba'azara. He was on a wooden platform that was constructed in the courtyard of the Beis Hamikdash, especially for this occasion. So now what's interesting is the pratim was Rashi sagt stehen in the Mishnah Masechta Soita. The details Rashi is giving us are there amongst other details as well in the Mishnah in Masechta Soita. Aber in the Mishnah stehen noch kame pratim was Rashi bringt nicht herab. Right, the various other details the Mishnah does describe that Rashi leaves out. For example, how the Sefer Torah was passed from one person to the next until eventually it was given to the king. The specific sections of the Torah that he read. The brachas that the king would say after concluding his reading. Rashi doesn't quote any of those details. The time is moving bepashus. The simplest reason why Rashi would do that is because Rashi's intention in his commentary is first and foremost to give us an understanding of the simplest meaning of the psukim. And it's not Rashi's task to get into all the various halachic details that are relevant to a particular mitzvah. If that's the case, is nikmuven. So if Rashi's goal is not to tell us halacha or the specifics of halacha, why does Rashi include certain specifics of halacha in this particular commentary? Because remember, Rashi is there to explain the pshat. So what about the pshat of the story of Hakhel requires us to know these particular details? The king reads from Vayeilech Dvarim on a wooden platform. And Beis is so why do we need to know the halacha? And surely they don't give us any insight into understanding the pshat of the pasuk, do they? Well, we'll discover obviously that they do. So the first thing Rashi tells us is that the king began to read from the beginning of Sefer Dvarim is verständig, that we understand. Because das ist die Abteich von der Welt, welche seine gesagt geworden Yeshua und zu Zikne Yisrael, Tikra es ha-Torah hazos. Because that is explaining what Moshe meant when he spoke to Yeshua and the other elders, saying, you should read this particular part of the Torah. First of all, Tikra is l'shon yochid. The first thing you'll notice is Moshe speaking to a group of people, and yet he uses Tikra, which is in the singular. Der tzavem men zok lach nachdem Hakhel l'shon yochid. So obviously the person who is going to be reading is the individual who is addressed with the word Hakhel, which is also a singular word. The person has to gather everybody together. Now, who could gather the entire nation together? So logic says the one person has the power to bring the whole nation together is the king. So therefore Rashi tells us, so who's going to read from the Torah? That same person, the king. The second thing Rashi has to tell us is, what does he have to read? So basis ha-Torah hazois, the fact that the pasuk tells us that he has to read this Torah, Rashi explains, meintas ha-Torah hazois loymar Hashem Elokeinu mitchilas eila hadvarim. It's relating to a pasuk. We have a pasuk right at the beginning of Sefer Dvarim where it says that Bayas HaTorah Hazois Leimer, that Moshe Rabbeinu explained HaTorah Hazois, the same language that is used here in the pasuk. So that's the reference point that Rashi is referring to. which teaches us that the king had to read from the beginning of Devarim. So that makes sense. Those two details make sense. But the next detail Rashi tells us that the king stood on a wooden platform that was placed in the Azara. Surely that has no relevance to our understanding of this pasuk. This pasuk doesn't describe anything about the setup of how Hakhel happened, just the requirement of what the king has to do. Why does Rashi bring it? So, maybe we'll make a suggestion, that Rashi has to tell us a little bit of this information because there is no description of how Hakhel happens that the child or the individual learning Chumash will know. Because Hakhel only occurred in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, the child learning Chumash is not going to find any further information about what Hakhel actually looked like. Und dazu is bisman habayis gufa is das nicht gewesen kein davar haragil. In fact, even in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, Hakhel wasn't a regular occurrence. Not einmal in 7 years, once in 7 years. So that would explain why Rashi gives us a reference point. Go study further in Masechta Sota as the protein for mitzvah Hakhel. Rashi sagt nicht, because Rashi wants us to know that there are many other details about Hakhel that he is not going to describe. So they're available, and if we want, we could go learn them in Masechta Sota. So that makes sense. Okay, we get it. Rashi is telling us, I know you're not going to get this information by learning Chumash. So here is the hyperlink. Click on this, and you'll find out where you can learn more about Hakhel. The only thing is, there's a problem with giving that particular answer for three reasons. Weil Aleph, was seinen getan geworden im Beis HaMikdash. Out of all the mitzvahs that were performed in the Beis HaMikdash, Hakhel is actually fairly simple. Let's say, for example, karbonos. You know how much detail is about karbonos? Why is it that when we come to karbonos, Rashi doesn't tell us where to go look in Zvachim to find out how to bring karbonos? But yet over here, a relatively simple, straightforward mitzvah, get together, listen to the king, he says you've got to find out the details in Sota. Why? Number two, base. If Rashi's whole point is to say, if you want to know more, look in Sota, that's where the Rashi commentaries should have ended. Why does Rashi add some of the detail, that there was this wooden platform for the king to stand on in the Hazara? And possibly the strangest part of it all is where Rashi puts his place marker of Kiddusim Masechta Sota. Rashi Gitav Zog Kiddusim Masechta Sota B'tchilas Pirushai or the B'seif Pirushai. Logic would have said that the reference to Masechta Sota should have either been the introduction to his commentary or the conclusion of his commentary. It doesn't make sense to stick it in the middle. So he's busy talking to us, telling us what the king is going to read, where the king is going to read, and in the middle of it, telling us where to look for further information. Was from Pashas l'shein Rashi is mashma, as it seemed to Masechta Sota batzitzich, norif das gesagte Faden hamelech hayikarim mitchilas hadvarim. Where Rashi places that reference, check Masechta Sota, makes it sound like check Masechta Sota to find more about what the king read, because that's where he puts it. He says the king read from the beginning of Eila Advarim, look in Sota, and then he adds other detail. Which is really unusual, because Rashi is talking about the construction of this bima, which is recorded in the Mishnah and Sota, and yet somehow truncates that, separates that from the part that says go look in Sota. Okay. So that's what we need to understand. What's Rashi really getting at over here? Why is he giving us some information, not other information? And why is specifically referring us to Sota in the middle of the whole conversation? In order to understand that, we've got to understand another issue that Rashi brings up. We've got to understand the first part of what Rashi told us. We could understand how Rashi reaches the point of understanding who is the person reading, the king. We already explained how that is logically, because it's tikra in the singular, and we got to think who is the singular individual who could bring everybody together. Logic says it's the king. That's one possibility. Or there's another way to know that it's the king who has to read, and therefore Rashi is telling us what's the other way to learn it? So the Mefarshim tell us, in the previous pasuk steht, Vaitzav Moshe Oisam. The previous pasuk says that Moshe instructed them meaning Yoshua and the Skenim is standing in front of him, L'shein Rabim, and that's a plural word. The next thing it says is, read the Torah, that's addressed in the singular. So we've got to assume as the Hatzach Moshe given to einem hamiyuchad that at that point in the conversation, Moshe must have turned his attention to somebody who is a unique member of the community. And because we know that who is the outstanding individual in the crowd that Moshe is addressing, it's Yoshua. So logic would say, as the Mefarshim point out, when he says Tikra, you should read, makes sense that he's addressing Yehoshua. And as Rashi has just pointed out to us, Yehoshua is the new rising king of the Jewish people. So that's the Mefarshim and how they explain it. The point being, how Rashi gets from our psukim to saying the Melech had to read, that is fairly straightforward. And what the king has to read, as we've already shown, Rashi can easily find the link because it's the expression as Torah hazois, which derives from the beginning of Parashas Devarim. So that's how we know he reads from the beginning of Parashas Devarim. Now, the interesting thing is, Rashi, just 2 psukim earlier, said that there's the Moshe, before he passes away, wrote the Torah. Und dort meint wenn hat geendigt die ganze Torah. There, the intention was that Moshe wrote HaTorah Zois, the entire Torah, at least he completed writing the whole Torah. But Rashi, as do meint HaTorah Zois, nicht die ganze Torah, no blois von Mishnah Torah. So that's why Rashi here has to clarify that despite the fact that 2 psukim earlier we used the expression as HaTorah Zois as a reference to the entire Torah, in this case, when we're describing what the king has to read, he does not have to get up and read the entire Torah to the Jewish people, besides the obvious that it's going to be really impractical if you get all these children hanging around for Hakhel, and then the king's going to read the whole Torah. Who knows how long that was going to take. But besides that, there's an association as HaTorah Hazois is language that references the beginning of Parashas Devarim or Sefer Devarim. But here's the question: the Shailei Zomer Aleph. How is Rashi absolutely sure that when the Torah says HaTorah Hazois, it only means from the beginning of Devarim and not the whole Torah? And let's not try and explain, well, that's why Rashi is referring to Soita. As if to say, well, the Pshat doesn't tell us clearly that HaTorah Hazois is only from Devarim. I've got to bring in a source from elsewhere. Because if I'm relying on a Mishnah in Soita to prove that HaTorah Hazois does not mean the whole Torah, then I'm basically saying, well, then the Pshat is that it does mean the whole Torah. So, how is Rashi absolutely convinced in Pshat that Es HaTorah Hazois does not mean that the king has to read the entire Torah? And Beis, especially considering that the language of the Torah, of the pasuk, is that you got to read this Torah. Why didn't Rashi use a very clear expression, Mishnah Torah, which we know is Devarim, or this book, because we're in Devarim, which would fit what the language of the Torah is. The Torah is describing the entire piece that he has to read. So, explain that the entire piece that he has to read is Mishnah Torah, or this Sefer. Nicht from Vanener's Maschil. Why is Rashi saying where he starts reading from? That doesn't seem to be the message that the Torah is giving us. So, don't think that Rashi wrote from the beginning of Dvarim because he wants to be speaking similar language to what the Mishnah speaks, or the halacha about Hakhel. Because we've already shown that Rashi's goal is not to tell us the details of halacha, but rather translating what the words in the pasuk mean. So let's understand what's Rashi getting at, what's driving Rashi's opinion, and we'll see this in a nuance in Rashi's language right at the beginning of his commentary. The key word in Rashi's interpretation that's going to help us understand what Rashi intends is he doesn't say that the king reads, he says HaMelech haya koirei, the king would read this particular section from the beginning of Eila Dvarim. It doesn't seem to make sense. We know that Rashi's objective is to explain what the pasuk means, not to tell us halacha. So Rashi should have, his intention is to explain the pasuk. He should have done in his typical style, quoted the word from the pasuk tikra, that you should read, and then filled in the context. Who should read? HaMelech. The fact that Rashi uses the expression the king would read, that illustrates that Rashi is not just translating or interpreting what tikra or who should read. Now that is vorgekommen the mitzvah von Hakhel. Hamelech hayo koirei is a description. Rashi is describing to us how Hakhel happened. He's not only defining for us who fits the requirement tikra, read from the Torah. Why is Rashi explaining to us part of the process of how Hakhel happened? Is the bir bozel? Well, the reason is this. If you want to read Parshas Vayeilech in context, in its simplest interpretation, what is Parshas Vayeilech all about? As Moshe erzählt, as Moshe is saying that he's reached 120 years, and is instructing them on how they should behave after he leaves this world. And what's going to happen after they leave this world? Then they're going to cross the Yarden River. Moshe calls and empowers Yehoshua, and he says, you're going to bring the people into Eretz Yisrael, and you're going to be the one to help them to inherit the land. So following that, where Moshe says, I'm stepping out, Yehoshua is stepping up, he's going to take you to inherit the land, then it says, that Moshe wrote the whole Torah and gave it to the Kohanim to, so to speak, look after. And then the next thing is Moshe gives the instruction of Hakhel. You would naturally assume that the instruction of Hakhel is a direct continuation from what was just discussed before, and which is the transfer of leadership from Moshe and the succession plan to Yehoshua. In other words, and you would think that Moshe is still speaking to that group of people, that nation, to the Kohanim b'nei Levi, and the Kohanim who have now taken the Sefer Torah as the custodians of the Jewish people. That's who he just gave the Torah to. And so you think, okay, I've just given the Sefer Torah to this group of people who are responsible, the Kohanim b'nei Levi, and Tikra, who should read it? Yehoshua, not as a king, but rather as the leader of the Jewish people going into Israel, and you could mistakenly then understand the instruction as that it might sound like Moshe is telling Yehoshua, 7 years after you cross the Yarden and you're in Eretz Yisrael, that's when you have to gather everybody together and inspire the community that they should have a commitment to Hashem and an awe of Hashem and fulfill mitzvahs. In other words, durch Yeshua's leinen Farzei HaTorah Azois Gans Torah, you would think you'd have a whole series of misinterpretations. Yeshua is the one who has to read. It happens 7 years after they cross into Eretz Yisrael, and the reading is the whole Torah, which is the Torah that Moshe has just handed over to the Kohanim. That's how you would naturally interpret this pasuk. Comes Rashi to say, well, that would be wrong. If it's a shayla zayin dem pirush, Rashi wants to illustrate clearly to us that would be a misinterpretation of the psukim. Therefore, zokt Rashi, hamelech ho yokeirei. Therefore, Rashi tells us the scenario is actually that the king would read. It's a particular formula, a particular ritual that has to happen. And it's mitchilasei dvarim, he has to read from the beginning of dvarim. Was damit macht der klar, in this Rashi is clarifying for us, firstly, as das given azovi venes is da melech, that this is a mitzvah that will apply when there is a king. In other words, a mitzvah ledoros, it's a long-term generational mitzvah. Whenever there's a king, it will apply. Not only after the initial 7 years of being in Israel. And based on is given The instruction is, yes, to Yehoshua, but not in his role as leader of the Jewish people into the promised land, but Yehoshua in his role as king. And lastly, Gimel, the third thing Rashi has to clarify for us is, don't misunderstand that they had to read the entire Torah at Hakhel, but rather only from the beginning of Dvarim. How does Rashi know this? The Hechach zu sagen, as macht nicht gelernt, die ganze Torah is movement by pashtus. It's clear how Rashi knows that the king would not read the entire Torah to the Jewish people. Bald as the kavana is given because the Torah tells us what the purpose of this reading was. Leman yishmu, that they should listen, leman yilmadu, and learn, v'yores Vayeilech, and fear the Eibishter, v'shamru lasis gomer, and therefore be dedicated to care for the observance of mitzvahs. Well, which part of the Torah is going to help you do that? Reading Parshas Noach? I don't know. Reading about the Makos? Maybe, maybe not. It's logical to say that those parashas in Torah that are designated specifically with a message about encouraging people to be fearful of Hashem and to observe Torah mitzvahs, those must be the parashas that he reads. That's why Rashi specifically says he would read from the beginning of Eila Advarim, nit Mishnah Torah v'chayotze b'seh. And he doesn't say read Mishnah Torah or read this book. He wants to specify Eila Advarim, weil in diverta Eila Advarim is mudgash, because that expression Eila Advarim highlights for us as to sein in divrei teichacha, that these are words of reprimand that Moshe gave to the Jewish people. And the reason for that reprimand is because this is a critical time, the succession moment in Moshe's life, and therefore he's got to encourage the people to greater commitment to Torah and mitzvahs, which is the purpose of Hakhel, and therefore it's from Eila Advarim. That's what Rashi wants us to know. Following from that, Moshe wants the king, who is going to be, in a sense, his replacement in every generation. Every 7 years for future generations, the king should repeat those sections that encourage and rebuke the Jewish people to get in line. You could ask, you'll say the truth is, even though there are clear sections in Sefer Dvarim that are on this theme that encourage us to greater commitment to Hashem, not every part of Dvarim is that way. Fine. So Rashi says, I just needed to illustrate to you what the theme of the reading has to be so that you don't make the mistake of thinking you've got to read the whole Torah. Now you want to know exactly which parashas. Look that up in Masechta Sotah. The most important thing Rashi wants us to know is where he started reading, both so we understand he's not reading the whole Torah and so we appreciate the objective of reading. Und dennoch gelernt, wie gesagt, in Masechta Sotah, wo es seinen ausgerechnet, welche Parashas in Eila Advarim der Melech hat gelernt und welche hat Medaille gewinnt. You need the further details of exactly which parashas were included and which were excluded. That you can read in Parashas Sotah. Now we have a practical question. If the intention of the king reading is that everybody should hear his reading, is nit muvan, something else doesn't make sense. How is this going to happen? We know that just adult, military age adults, males, was already 600,000 Jewish people. Dazu kommen zu Jüngere von Essen, in Eretz Yisrael noch dem, is meglich, balachas kama v'kama, in Eretz Yisrael noch dem. So what's going to happen? That's 600,000 military age males. Now add in the younger people, the older people, the children, the women, and then generations that are going to develop and produce, please God, in Eretz Yisrael. Now Rashi has a practical question. How is it feasible that everybody's going to hear what the king has to say? You'll say, why is this a question now? There are many times the Torah records that Moshe addressed the entire Jewish people and nobody raised an eyebrow then. Well, there's a few things to consider. Aleph, first of all, when Moshe addressed the community, there's no indication in the Torah that they brought their wives and children as well. There's also no indication that every single Jew had to hear every single word from Moshe Rabbeinu simultaneously. In fact, to the contrary, we have the whole order that the Rambam tells us about who came and how it was transmitted, information implying that not everybody was necessarily there every single time. Mashenkin do, this is a different mitzvah and scenario. The imperative is that the entire nation has to gather, including women and children. So that's a huge amount of humanity. Beis, on the mitzvah is tikras gomer be'ozneim gomer, and in order to fulfill the mitzvah of Hakhel, the king has to get his message into their ears. In other words, it's not good enough if they stand there but they can't hear. So how's it going to happen? Therefore, Rashi says, well, here's the practicality. They made a platform for the king to stand on, a platform that allowed people not only to hear but to see, because when you can see the person's facial expressions and their lips moving, it actually helps you hear better. So Rashi's bringing up this detail because otherwise the pshat of the pasuk doesn't make sense. How can you have Hakhel? How can everybody hear the king's message? But if Rashi is going to describe a platform, he can't leave us hanging. There are certain critical pieces of information we need to know about that platform for practical and for halachic reasons. So therefore, Rashi has to explain what kind of a platform made out of wood, and it's in the Azorah. Because without that information, that it is a temporary wooden platform in the Azorah, we, based on things we'd learned previously, might have misunderstood how Hakhel works. And then we would have got the pshat wrong. Number one. Firstly, the pasuk describing Hakhel says that you've got to read the Torah. When is it? It's at the time where the entire Jewish nation comes to see Hashem's so-called face. Where is that? Well, you would assume that the place where you have this closeness to Hashem represented by Hashem's face would have to be inside the Hakhel building. Now, to get everybody, the entire population inside the Hakhel building, that would be a nes ochi gadol. It would be a huge miracle. And how are you going to build a platform inside the Hakhel of the Beis Hamikdash? Therefore, Rashi says, no, it's outdoors, in the courtyard. We find numerous times, particularly when Moshe Rabbeinu and Aaron HaKohen had to confront the Jews on various issues, that Hashem's Shechina presence actually appears outside of the building of the Ohel Moed, at the entrance to the Ohel Moed. So therefore Rashi has to tell us it's Ba'azorah. Don't make the mistake of thinking we're going to cram all of the Jewish people inside the building of the Hakhel. Second of all, we at this point have learned about the Mishkan as in Yonah Mishkan that there are activities that happen on a daily basis in the Mishkan. And of course, those activities would repeat in the Beis Hamikdash, the Karbonos, the Shira, etc. So how could you have a big platform, a big stage built inside the Beis Hamikdash that you're going to use once in 7 years? That's going to be such an impediment to all the other things that we have to do in the Beis Hamikdash for the rest of the time. And therefore Rashi says it was made out of wood. That's why he says, firstly, the actual material is wood, which is a more temporary material, easy to assemble and disassemble. But he also says, Vos hoyu oisin. He says they made it specially for that purpose. They built this platform once every 7 years and then they dismantled it afterwards so that you won't have the issue of the concern of, how does this all practically work? It's also interesting, by the way, because we know that there's a halacha that says that you are not allowed to remove a stone from the Beis Hamikdash. If this bima was going to be made out of stone, it would have to be permanent, because once it was constructed as part of the Beis Hamikdash, you're not allowed to dismantle it. So therefore, Rashi is telling us it's made out of wood. Therefore, it was dafka possible to take it down after the Hakhel was over. Now, that's a beautiful insight. Now we understand why Rashi had to give us these specific nuggets of information, because without them we wouldn't understand the pshat. In doing so, he gives us a fascinating perspective in halacha, as Rashi sometimes does. Menyonim ufloim derech halacha, was man can herausnehmen from dem Pirush Rashi, to use an expression from the Shaloh HaKadosh. There are these incredible insights that Rashi gives us to halacha. Here's one of them. In dem was der Melech lehnt die Parashas from Mishnah Torah is dort zwei Svaros. So there are two philosophical perspectives on the king's requirement to read these parashas to us on Hakhel. Tzidos adin in Melech. Is it a halacha in the halachas that define the role of a king? Das heißt, das ist eine von der Chiyuve HaMelech, as bis man Hakhel darf lernen die Parashat Torah far kol ha'am. In other words, it's part of the duties of a king that every 7 years he has to get up at Hakhel and read these parashas to the people. Oder das adin mitzvahs Hakhel. Or it's a mitzvah that falls into the realm of Hakhel. Hakhel requires a king. As the parashas dafen demot geleint werden durch ein Melech. That in order to fulfill the mitzvah of Hakhel, you need these parts of the Torah read by a king. Okay, so is it a chiyuv on the king as part of his role, or is it in order to facilitate Hakhel, you need a king? So you can have the same question about the platform. Why do you need a platform in the Beis HaMikdash? Do we need a platform because it's a king? A king doesn't stand on the floor. His dignity is that he's got to stand on a raised platform. So therefore, that's why we, as respect to the king, have to create a big bima for him to stand on. Or is it a part of the parameters of Hakhel require that there's a stage for the king to read from? So obviously it would be a matter of which section of Torah teaches us this detail that the king has to read from the Torah. Rashi b'Pirusha Mishnah zogt. When Rashi comments on the Mishnah, he says, that reading of Hakhel has to be done by the king. Why? Because if you look in Sifri, when it describes the requirements and duties of a king, it says, he has to write for himself a second Torah besides the Torah that every ordinary person has to have. And from that, the Sifri learns, that's the Sefer Torah he has to use to read on Hakhel. In other words, the Sifri and the Mishnah are deriving. How do we know that the king has to read a piece of Torah at Hakhel? We learn it from part of the duties of a king. But it's part of his responsibility. And by the way, that would indicate clearly that the Sefer Torah he has to read from at Hakhel has to be his personal royal Sefer Torah. Whereas if you're going to argue that the source of the requirement for the king to read from the Torah is in our parasha Vayeilech, because it says Tikra, he, that one individual who has the capacity to gather every person together, is the one who has to read, Kanal, which is the attitude Rashi is taking here in his commentary on Chumash, is moving adas is eine von den dinim mitzvahs Hakhel, then it's not a mitzvah contingent on the king, it's a mitzvah that is required as part of the Hakhel process. And in that case, he'd actually be learning the Sefer Torah that is kept in the Azara, not his personal Sefer Torah. So what's Rashi's view? As Rashi Rashi, in his commentary on Torah, which is the simplest understanding of the psukim, derives as in Yonim Zanechiyuvim and Protedinim in Mitzvahs Hakhel. Rashi says the pshat of the pasuk is that the king's requirement to read from the Torah is not part of his royal duties, but part of the Hakhel mitzvah. Was man lernt von dem Pasuk in Parashas Hakhel, Tikra es ha-Torah hazois, and the specifics that the king has to read from the Torah is derived from the Tikra. He has to, as part of Hakhel, be the one to read the Torah. So the fact that the king has to read, and the fact that there has to be a stage he stands on in order to read, the reason for the stage is so we can fulfill our requirement of Hakhel by hearing what the king has to say. It's not because the king needs that dignity and royal flourish to stand up on a stage. That's pshat. Whereas when Rashi is explaining how the Gemara and Mishnah sees things, is a mefarish pshuta shel Mishnah. There Rashi has to explain based on the Mishnah approach to understanding Torah. Und the Mishnah ruft das on Parashas HaMelech. The Mishnah doesn't call it the parasha of Hakhel, actually calls it the parasha of the king. And the entire thrust and approach of the Mishnah is to highlight the dignity and greatness of the king. Firstly, it says that the king sits on this great platform. And then Chazan HaKnesses notil Sefer Torah v'noisn l'Rosh HaKnesses v'Rosh HaKnesses l'Izgan chol l'Kohen Gadol v'Kohen Gadol noisn l'Melech. And there's a whole chain of who passes the Sefer Torah going up the chain of command until eventually you get to the supreme chain of command, which is the king. As the Gemara says, all of this was to highlight the great value and dignity of the king. And that's why he sat when he read from the Torah, also to highlight his greatness. Likewise, the Mishnah, when it talks about the platform, says the platform is made for him, for the king. Therefore, when Rashi is commenting on the Mishnah and the Gemara, he refers to the Sifri, which says, why is there an obligation for the king to read? Because it's part of Parashas HaMelech, what he was instructed in his duties as a king, as dosa din mitzvahs melech, totally different to how he interprets here according to Pshutei Shel Mikra, where the king reading is actually part of the mitzvah of Hakhel. What's the lesson for us? So here's the Chassidus on this Rashi. As we well know and discussed numerous times, Torah is eternal. Even though currently we cannot fulfill Hakhel in the original format inside the Beis Hamikdash with a real king. In the Mishkan Hamikdash Prati was kol echad ve'echad miYisrael. But the fact is that there is a personal Beis Hamikdash and a personal spiritual experience of Hakhel that is alive and well today. What is the purpose of Hakhel? The Teichen for Hakhel by jeden Eden is the Kibbutz v'Hakola von alle seine Keiches HaNefesh und sein Machshava Dibro Maaseh. In the same way as the macro Hakhel is bringing all the diverse parts of the Jewish population together in unity, the personal version of Hakhel is bringing all the various components of our persona, of our character, of our neshama together in unity. Our thoughts, our speech, our action, our einbringen und our einstellen, die alle in der Beis Hamikdash apnimi seinem, they should all gather inside the Beis Hamikdash in a place of holiness, of pristine connection to Hashem. That's what we all got to do. We've got to bring ourselves into a space of absolute connection. And the way that it works is the king has to read from the Torah. This reading of the Torah, remember that when we say the word reading, it's got the same meaning as the word to call. So we're summoning, we're drawing all these powers into a focus. Who's going to summon all of those powers? The king. The internal king that each of us has within our neshama represents our complete dedication to Hashem, our Kabbalah soul, our absolute acceptance of Hashem's authority. And that's similar to what the Tzemach Tzedek explains in Mitzvahs Minu Melech in Derech Mitzvah Secha about why we have kings, as the Melech is Mamshech Dominion from Kabbalah soul and Yiras Hashem to Ala Eden, that the role and purpose of the king is to be able to stimulate and empower every single Jewish person to have that absolute dedication to Hashem and acceptance of Hashem's authority. And if dem sagt man as am Melech hoyakeire is again the mitzvah din or mitzvah Hakhel. So look at how Rashi is telling us that this works. The fact that the king has to read, which we're now explaining means, the fact that this sense of Kabbalah soul has to bring all of our faculties together in commitment to Hashem is part of the Hakhel experience, not just part of the king's responsibility, it's part of the Hakhel experience. The purpose of Hakhel is that we should listen and learn and come to be in awe of Hashem. Is dafka dan ven es kommt mitzad Kabbalah soul. It only works when the precipitating factor, where the motivating force is a king, is Kabbalah soul. If we're looking to focus ourselves to do what Hashem wants based on what we appreciate and understand, we could land up being sensitized to our own needs and our own biases, which would detract from a full-blown experience of being in awe of Hashem. Whereas when we come from an approach of Kabbalah soul, who am I listening to? The king voice, the voice that says you've got to dedicate yourself to Hashem. Absolutely, that's when a person will taka reach Vayeilech Hashem. So then come to Hemshech, but then there's another detail that's really important and got to be balanced very well. As the Kabbalah soul Kabbalah soul and awe of Hashem should not flatten and destroy us and turn us into a shmata. It should also be a platform. Meaning, if a person only feels fear and awe of Hashem, and only feels Kabbalah soul, the person could turn into a shmata. And if a person feels so inadequate, so much of a shmata, then you can't actually serve Hashem properly. Therefore, you've got to have the element of bima. Bima is a raised platform, means a person has to raise themselves up with a certain amount of confidence and strength. Yizgaber ka'ari, like the Shulchan Aruch says, we have to get up with the power and strength of a lion. Because if we have that confidence and we have that strength, we're able to then overcome our Yetzer Hara. The Yargis Adam Yetzer Tov al Yetzer Hara, as the Gemara says, that a person should always agitate the Yetzer Tov to overcome the Yetzer Hara. So you've got to have that sense of inner strength. Can't just be, I'm totally dedicated to Hashem to the point that I fall to pieces. Und der Gebovis Nasses in der Kabbalah so peilt as the Kriya von Amelech HaYakeres soll der Hert werden. And when a person can have that strength, confidence, and sense of upliftment, then the message of the king resonates. To the extent that we have the impact that Hakhel would have had. Hakhel left people glowing with inspiration afterwards and feeling a sense of dedication that lasted through the whole year. The same thing happens to us when we're guided by the sense of Kabbalah soul with a healthy sense of strength. But in order to do this, you've got to have the right kind of platform, and that has two elements to it. As Dav Zayin Shal Eitz, firstly, the platform has to be wood, not stone, and Bei Shal Yosim Bazar, it has to be built inside the Azara, meaning the Tnur Shal Bima Hagbovis Nasas, that sense of feeling uplifted and confident, and maybe even a sense of being higher. Zol No Zayin Befen Arai Shal Eitz has to be wood, and it has to be a temporary feeling. In other words, it can't be my main attitude. And where does the platform belong? Only in the Azara, in the places of holiness. When I'm working on bringing all of the components of myself towards dedication to Hashem, that's when I should feel that strength and confidence. But if I'm doing something else that's not in that holy environment, when I am not currently involved in something elevated, which is all about connection to Hashem, then I've got to be careful, because then a platform, that sense of confidence and sense of being a tefach hecher, could turn into something which is unhealthy, could turn into chas v'shalom arrogance. But verständig in die Tag von Achone zu Shnas Hakhel, all of this is particularly relevant as we're in the time preparing for a Shnas Hakhel, as the Yoder Rebbe said, the Sicha. Geht man jeden in die Keiches of Ken durchführen, der Minion von Hakhel in seinem Mikdash HaPrati, that empowers every single one of us to succeed in achieving this goal of our personal Hakhel. Und durch dem ist man sicher zu mekayim sein mitzvahs Hakhel kipshutoi, and by us experiencing a personal micro Hakhel, that paves the way to experience the absolute macro Hakhel. In the Beis HaMikdash HaShlishi, in the third Beis HaMikdash, and we'll hear the Kriya B'Torah from Melech HaMoshiach, and we'll be able to hear Melech HaMoshiach, the ultimate king, reading these parshas of the Torah for us. In Bishnas Hakhel Abolin V'Kol Yisrael Teva, and that should happen in this Shnas Hakhel.